We are not creating any component or filter using any new keyword by ourselves. That is what is getting done in the background. So dependency injection is not just about not using a new keyword. It is more about injecting certain dependency into a component. So yeah, definitely, Shubhi, I mean, if you no answer is a wrong one, I can't say that you are saying exactly something which is incorrect. But when you're going for an interview, you need to be very near to what it exactly is. So the exact sort of output which a technical person or some interviewer would look for is you are depending, you have certain component which depends on a service which you are trying to inject. How? Inside a constructor. You can create a private property of that particular object type, or you can create a public property. That is up to you. But inside a constructor, you're defining the dependencies. And this Angular framework that you have, it is making that dependency injection by itself. Internally, it is maintaining a instance of that service, and then it is giving that particular component the instance of that particular service. So that is, I would say, a better explanation. But yeah, you can add this particular stuff as well, that while creating or while injecting these components into your own component, you're not using any new keyword. Your framework is getting this work done for you. So then we can have questions like, what is a multi-modular system, and why do you require that? So why would you like to have multiple modules in your application? If someone asks you in a single go, one line answer first and then the explanation. So why do you guys think, what is a multi-modular system and why do we require that? What are modules in Angular? So when we are saying we are creating multiple modules in Angular, that means a multi-modular system. Let's say I'm working with the employee management, and this employee management contains multiple small functionalities. One has to do with attendance, one has to do with some salary management, one has to do with the bonus management. So you can create multiple modules: bonus module, attendance module, then you can have salary module, and these salary module will have salary component, salary increment component, salary update component, salary delete component. So yeah, a multi-modular system is a system containing multiple modules into your application. And what you do with those modules is you are making your application divide into small components and even smaller, subparts. So a big application can be divided into component, but even before that, you can divide a big application into multiple modules. So it's just, there's no mandate that you should create a multi-modular system, but the requirement or why we create that is to have, let's say you have a big team and you have to develop big software. So what you'll do is you'll divide your software into multiple modules, and to each team, you'll give a specific responsibility that you have to get a specific work done. You have to deal with the attendance management system. One has to deal with the salary management, other with the bonus management, other with, let's say, some resignation management, and so on. So multi-modular is just making your application more modular, segregate that application into further subparts, and so that we can have some parts and some bits and bytes which they mold together to create a bigger website. Okay. So again, they would expect you to know something about what is a multi-modular system. So you can say, okay, we can create certain shared module. There could be also some modules which are shared between all other modules. So their task is to create certain components which are reusable in other components. So that way we can have some multi-modular modules that we have. So the next question that people usually ask is, although it's very do you use CLI tools? So what CLI tools have you used? How have you created your application using CLI? So any input again? So where did we use this command line interface in terms of our Angular project? So we can create components, we can create classes, we can create interfaces, we can create the entire project itself. And what we can do is, yeah, I can generate some help. I can look for what all commands it has. I can use ngserve in order to start the application. I can use ngbuild in order to build the application. So these are all command line tools. So usually the question is asked, what are the CLI tools? So this is what they are referring to. Okay, so yeah, all these generate, new, serve, build, these are all CLI tools. Then there could be a question, what are the kinds of binding that we have? What are the bindings that we have in Angular? What kind of bindings we have? How can you bind a particular property to certain components and all? Different ways, if you can just elaborate what all you remember. So this is brief categorization, one-way binding, two-way binding, using interpolation. For one-way binding, you can say data-bind property. For one-way binding, we can use interpolation. For two-way binding, we have to use banana inside a box representation. So next could be, what are attribute directives and how can we use them, or what are their usage? So what are attribute directives in Angular? What do you mean by attribute directives? So did we use that inside our session? So any thought process regarding attribute directive? So attribute directives are some attributes, just like the class, the ID, the style. So you can create similar attributes which add certain properties to your, let's say, component that you have created. Let's say, what attribute did we add? We created an attribute component where when we used to hover on that particular component, the color used to change to green and some border used to change. So no, that's not Aradhe, that's not the attribute. Yeah, that is general attribute, Angular syntax to provide value to a variable. Not sure what you are referring to, but attribute directive are those directive, as we if you remember, we were putting down an attribute directive which says let's say, change color of DOM element to whichever component this particular attribute might be attached. That will change the color when you hover over that particular component. So if you remember, we created one such attribute wherein if we put that attribute on any of the component, the color starts changing to a specific color that we have defined. We were trying to use the native element over there. We can update the styles, we can update the visibility, we can update any of the DOM property, because over there we are getting the DOM element, and then you can play around with that particular DOM element inside those attribute directives that you create. So this star ngif is a structural directive, Shankar, if that is what you're talking about. Star ngif if says if that particular value is correct, or that is a true the value, then you have to change some structure. So the star ngif if is a structural directive. Attribute directive was the color changing component that we created. Once you hover over a component, the color changes. So yeah, and why are those attributes directive used? Basically I want to provide some common functionalities on hovering. I want some common functionality on, let's say, change of an event. I want a common functionality on clicking of a particular button, and so on. There could be multiple end case scenarios for this. So next I would ask you, what are the different ways to share data amongst the different component? So if two component has to interact together, what are the different ways to share data amongst them, share information amongst them, and anything that you want to share? So yep, you can use at the rate input director decorator. So when is this at the rate input getting used? In which scenario? There's a very specific scenario wherein you can use at the rate input. So we can use at the rate input when we have a parent-child relationship. So the data transfer, when you want from a parent to a child component, then you can use at the rate input directive to define what data you have to send from parent to child. Let's say we don't have any parent-child relationship. What then? How will you share data? What is the other way wherein you can share the data? Any other way that we might have discussed during the session? If you remember any way in which two components can share data together. So the one at the rate input is a data sharing between child and the parent property. So don't you think services are the way to share data between different components? You create one service, you can inject into multiple components. Each of these components will have all the values, all the functions, all the properties that you have inside this particular service. So I would say, creating services, these services is one another way in order to work out with data sharing between components. Agree or not? So you can create some data calls, you can write some common code which has to be used across the application. You can save certain common data that exists. So let's say for the very first time when you log into an application, you ask user for a username and password. So you put down some username and you put down some password and you press submit. On pressing the submit, there would be a call which goes to the network, or it goes in the background. It tries to see whether the user who's using this particular application is an authenticated user or not. Once this username and user password is found correct, then this particular server might fetch the entire user details. So this user is the user of this particular application. So what I can do is, in this common service of mine, which can say user service or user detail service, this can contain the data about a particular user, and this service can be shared across all the components, everything inside the Angular, so that you have to just get the user detail once from the background, and then you can share them between all the users. So that is one real-time implementation. When you log in, you get the user information, you save it inside some Angular component, inside some Angular service, and you make use of this Angular service in different components. So the next question that I can think about, again, we'll come to JavaScript in a while, but yeah, I'm first covering the basic question and most important questions that usually you would be expecting in the interview. So again, someone has asked me this question already: what is ahead of time compilation and just in time compilation? So just in time compiler is a scenario wherein we have an Angular compiler. So whatever these these selectors that we are creating, these @injectable, @pipe, this is very native to Angular. JavaScript does not know what is @injectable. You know, it doesn't know what is @component. It doesn't know what is module. So what happens is, usually if you are using a just-in-time compiler, when you are loading your Angular application, a JavaScript compiler will be loaded into your browser memory. And whenever you make some request to some URL, you want to get some data, you want to get some page out of this particular application, make a request to this particular compiler, the just-in-time compiler, that you require a certain page to render. That particular page requires certain style file, it requires certain HTML file, and it requires certain TS file. So on the spot, that particular compiler will go in the background and will get some data for your application. It will compile it, it will convert the Angular component into a JavaScript equivalent, and it will render your page. Whereas a ahead of time compiler does this already. So it doesn't load that compiler into your browser memory. So what happens is, if you're not loading this browser or this compiler into the browser memory, first of all, your browser would be faster, your application would be faster, you're using less of the browser memory. And then what we are doing is, we are compiling everything ahead of time. Even before running this application, we have already everything compiled, and it has to just get displayed on the application. So when we are using some just ahead of time compiler, then our application has a faster speed. So as Shankar has said, compile runtime. So while you are running your application and when you compile at runtime, this is called JIT. When you have already done the entire compilation and the code, the code compilation and code evaluation before starting the application itself, it is ahead of time compilation. Any other question? We missed one more point when we were saying that how to do an inter-component communication. We just missed a point. Can someone tell me what point did we miss? So we talked about how a parent can communicate to a child. We talked about how independent components can communicate within each other using services. But I want to know how a child component can trigger some message to the parent component. So I think we missed this. So how a child will notify about certain event or some data to a parent? Not through a view child. View child is again, a parent having a view child property of a child component. So the correct answer would be event emitter. So you are emitting an event which is captured by some other component. One thing very specific, I would tell you more about event emitter is event emitter can be used anywhere. It can be used inside a service. It can be used inside a component. It can be even used in cases when you don't have a parent component. Event emitter is anything which can emit some event. So when we are working with event emitters, we just need to have someone who can emit an event and someone who can capture an event. So this is a big domain. I would say again, the time that we and the expertise that we looked for in Angular, we didn't cover this event emitter in a great depth, but I would advise you guys to look for what is an event emitter and how does it work. So what is an event emitter and how does it work for that? So one implementation we have seen in a parent child, and there are many more, events are not native to Angular. They are native to JavaScript itself. So JavaScript has event, everything. Click is an event, blur is an event, on click is an event, on blur, on mouse over, on double click, on key down, on key up. These are all events. So internally, your browser is capturing all these events. You are having some event emitters internally, and you can also create your custom event emitters. So that is what we did. So we created a custom event emitter in the child component, and the parent was trying to track that. But yeah, I would advise you to go back and learn more about what are event emitters. So I think we missed few questions. I would say the question is, what is GIT? Data communication between. So event emitter is definitely something that you need to focus more. You need to learn more about event emitter, but that is an advanced part. Don't right away get into what is the event emitter, how does it work. But yeah, spend some time with JavaScripts and spend some time with Angular, understand the basics. And this is probably one thing that you can keep a note on that you can learn further. Okay, so internally everything is an event, a click, a blur, a mouse over, mouse, click. Everything is an event, and you should know how to create custom events and emit them and capture them. So these are certain things that you are expected in Angular, although there are many more things. But yeah, basic question line that you can follow on the Angular part. Then the normal question says, do you know how to create custom filters? What are filters? So I'll put down these questions. So what are filters and pipes? People would ask you either pipe or filter. What are pipe or filters? How to create custom pipe? So can anyone tell me some syntactical stuff that you remember for creating a pipe? Which was the method that was required in order to create a pipe? What do you want to import in order to create a pipe? So we were importing two functionality, pipe and pipe transform. So the class where we want to implement this pipe, we were trying to implement pipe, an interface pipe over there. And then we were using a functionality transform in order to specify what the pipe would do with this particular input. So how will the pipe work is specified inside a function called transform. So what are structural directive and which all structural directive you know? So the structural directive are what we talked about, star ng if, star ng for, wherein you're defining how the structure should be on the basis of certain conditions or some iterations. So then the question could be, what are decorators? Now this question can be asked both in the sense of JavaScript and Angular. So it depends. It would be great if you can start from what is decorator in JavaScript, which says decorator is anything that adds certain metadata to a function or a particular property or a particular class. So it's a metadata information. And Angular use these decorators in order to define or tell that a particular class is either a component or a module or a pipe or a directive or a injectable. So this is Angular way of identifying whether a particular stuff is uh, a component stuff, or some it could be pipe, it could be directive, it could be injectable, some module, a shared module or something. So what is a decorator? Decorator is certain metadata about a particular class, function or a property in JavaScript. And in Angular, we are using decorator in order to identify specific features. First of all, whether the component, it's a component or pipe. And then if it's a component, then what are the properties? What is the what is the selector? What are the template URL? So you're providing metadata. Then what we can say is, what is this notation? How do you read this notation? What do we mean by this? So we say, okay, banana inside a box. But what does this banana inside a box represent? How does this notification comes? How can you break this down into pieces? And what does it mean? It means two-way binding. But can you intuit something from this as well, this notation? It contains a square bracket and a normal bracket. If you remember, the normal bracket we use for events like click, blur, on mouse over, on key down, on key up. So these events are always enclosed inside a bracket. If we have some property that contains some data, that we always enclose inside a square bracket. Let's say value, source, or style.color.pixel. All those value we are putting down in a square brackets, which means in order to bind a property, you use square bracket. In order to bind events, you use these normal brackets. But what we have in a two-way binding is a collection of both property binding and the event binding. How property binding? Property binding is the actual value of that particular element, an input box. So to an input box, you are adding a particular value. So you are binding a value. So there comes a square bracket. Why this normal bracket? Because we are also binding internally a event. What is the event? On change. So whenever someone changes something on that particular input box, Angular get to know that something has changed and now it has to reflect it back to the component. So this banana inside a box is a sort of, attribute binding as well as the, let's say, some event binding combined into one single notation. So this square outside is the attribute binding. This normal bracket over here is a event binding. Event is on change. Square is property, which is value. So we are binding the value property along with we are attaching a on change event to this particular input box. That is what we mean by banana inside a box notation. Then the next question would be, what is a single page application? What are SPAs and how is it beneficial to us? How these SPAs are beneficial to our application? Why is the world moving towards this SPA? So first of all, if you can help me with what is a SPA, what are the benefits, how we use them, why we use them? So some answers from your side. It doesn't reload the page, it increases the application speed, doesn't hit the server again and again. Then we have, show data, same page. Again, navigation between tabs, don't refresh the whole page. The problem with refreshing the whole page is that all the components, all the style, all the JS will be reloaded. So we are just, preventing that extra, flow information. Number of call will be reduced to every time. Yeah, no reload needed. So yeah, these are all the aspect why we are using a single page application. Any example of a single page application? The best example is Gmail. We are using it every day. So which module help you to enable the single page architecture? So we were using a router module over there, and that is required for making the single page application. And why is this routing module required? Because we need to define the routes. We need to define all the possible async, all the possible routes that we have in our application. Shankar, you can definitely create single page application with only Ajax. But again, if you are using only Ajax, then let's say if you are working with the application where you have the employee detail page, employee deletion page, employee updation page. So every time when a button is clicked, let's say I want to update. I'm on a particular employee list or detail. I click the button update. Then you have to manually do a lot. You have to manually hide that particular detail page or that detailed div that you have, and you have to put down the display property of that particular div as none, and you have to show this update page, and you have to manage a lot of things by yourself. So if you're doing with just Ajax, yeah, you don't even need to use Angular application in order to create a single page application. But this is all for the sake of ease. Everything is there in JavaScript and Ajax. We just want to make it easy for the programmer to work out with these concepts. So if you're working with the Ajax only, then you have to hide and show certain pages, certain divs that you want to hide on the basis of URL. You have to track the URL change by yourself. Okay, so there's lot many things that you might have to do in case you are not using a single page application or these router modules. So another question, like which language are we putting down our Angular? Which is a language in which we are putting down our Angular code? It is TypeScript. So do our browser understand TypeScript? So how does this TypeScript code run into my application or my browser, I would say? So what is this conversion to JS called? So compilation is when you compile from one language to another, when you change the syntactical stuff from one language to another. So whenever we are moving from TypeScript to a JS file, so it is called as a transpiler. Okay, so we internally, when we are creating this application using ng-new, we have an inbuilt transpiler which transpiles the entire TS code into JavaScript. I'll move to the next domain because this Angular is not just Angular, it's a wrapper over JavaScript, it's a wrapper over ES6. So Shankar, yeah, so definitely there are disadvantages as well. The disadvantage is if you have a very simple application which displays certain data, let's say. So you have a simple application which makes a Ajax call and just displays the data. It do not have any dynamic aspect to it. Then in that case, if you are implementing Angular, definitely you are increasing the complexity. So the disadvantage is whenever you are putting down Angular, you are definitely increasing a lot of complexity. So before you start putting in your Angular into certain application, you need to ask yourself that is my application dynamic or static. If your application is static, you need not to use a Angular framework. And we have further disadvantages as well, but that disadvantage would come once you start comparing React versus Angular, Knockout versus Angular, Knockout versus Backbone. So when you start comparing two different languages together, then you start getting more disadvantages and advantages. But yeah, the frameworks like Angular, it completely changed the UI world. It completely changed how people used to see a front-end developer. So first, earlier we used to have, front-end designers. So they used to say, okay, a front-end guy is there for styling the application, for putting normal validation, for putting normal, some CSS into the application. But this Angular completely changed the world. The people, see a JavaScript developer. Now a JavaScript developer is more of a developer rather than a designer. So earlier people used to demand for, we want HTML and JavaScript designers. So now biggest advantage is, it converted a designer into a developer. We are no longer just looking into the styling of application. We are actually writing the business logic of our applications. So advantages are many, disadvantages are very few. So I won't emphasize a lot on the disadvantage because I have worked in those times when we used to work with native JavaScript, and I don't see any advantage. One obvious advantage I would say again is the speed. And once you are working with JavaScript and once you are working with the wrapper over JavaScript, then there is a speed difference. So working with core JavaScript, if used correctly, there's a clause with this. If you're using the JavaScript correctly, and if you are working with the native JavaScript, definitely that application can be faster than an Angular application. But again, this clause is a very big clause, using the JavaScript effectively and efficiently, because most of the UI people, they have worked on React, they have worked on Knockout, they have worked on this Angular, they have worked on different frameworks, but none of them has worked with core JavaScript. So making the design implementation of JavaScript correct is ideally a lot of effort taking task. And definitely, if you're working with the wrappers, it do involve a lot of more extra code that you have put in. So sometime if you're doing simple application, your JavaScript code is much faster than your Angular code. But yeah, that again has a lot of star marks associated. So definitely, Angular, React, and all these front-end framework has got a lot of benefits. So I don't have much disadvantage to talk about. The disadvantage is every year you are getting new versions, you are getting new libraries. This year, we came across a Svelte, which is, a language which is again getting into the market. Next year we might be having some other language. So this is one big disadvantage that you have to, talk about different different languages at different time. So the question with Shankar Tiwari, you want me to talk about Angular versions. So I'll talk about Angular versions. So we started with Angular 1. Okay, so the initial version of Angular was Angular 1. The Angular 1 was the application which is purely JavaScript based. You never use TypeScript into it. That was not object oriented. That was not componentized. Okay, so okay, that was a bit componentized, but yeah, I would say Angular 1 was more of a JavaScript application rather than a TypeScript application. And then, some folks, so that is called Angular JS. Angular JS, what officially we name that. So this version is Angular. That version was called Angular JS. So Angular JS was Angular 1.0 to Angular 1.7. Okay. And then came Angular 2, a complete, makeover, which changed the JavaScript world to a TypeScript world. They implemented object-oriented concepts. They started introducing the usage of decorators. They started having a lot of focus on the component-based architecture. So that was the intent. So moving from Angular 1 to Angular 2 was the biggest, change and biggest hurdle for them, because for a JavaScript developer who has worked years with the functional programming, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of object oriented designs over there. So Angular lost lot of its community, lots of its people, when it switched from Angular JS to Angular, because not many people were happy with the decision of making Angular a perfect object oriented design stuff. I don't want TypeScript. TypeScript is sort of deceiving. You don't have interfaces in JavaScript, but in TypeScript you have. You don't have generics in JavaScript, but you have it in TypeScript. And at the end, the TypeScript is converted into JavaScript, which means TypeScript is nothing but a compile time check, not more than that. So people were not happy with the fact that we are using a object oriented approach, and then majority of people started using a new language which was React. Okay, so React is a framework by Facebook. So the Facebook page that you see right now is a React application. So a lot of shift was there. People didn't like any of the object oriented concepts and principles, and the introduction of TypeScript as a mandatory language for Angular. And a lot of people then shifted to React. I mean, even I was the one who shifted from Angular to React just because of this reason, because I don't like TypeScript. And it's not about liking TypeScript, it's more about there's nothing called object orientation in JavaScript. JavaScript is not object oriented, but TypeScript present you this particular JavaScript as a object oriented language, which is not the case. So that is altogether a very big discussion. I won't get into it, but TypeScript is quite deceiving. So I would say Angular 1 to Angular 2, a big change. So people, started using classes. People started using ES6. So all the syntax is there inside Angular, which is 2 and above. Then, we never had Angular 3. So after Angular 2, the company came up with Angular 4. And Angular 4 also gave us a big difference. So earlier we used to use, so let's say if you have to make some AJAX calls, if you have to get some data asynchronously. So in that particular case, what you have to do is we used to use promises in Angular 2. So in Angular 2, we used to use something which is promises. And again, promise is a big domain in JavaScript. So Angular 4.0 moved from promises to a concept called these observables. So again, we have a technology which is called Rxcs. If you want to read certain lines about it, definitely you can. So there's something which is called as Rxcs. So I can put that down over here. I can put down a question. What is Rxcs? So Rxcs, the full form of Rxcs is reactive extension of JavaScript. Okay, so there is something called, we also talked about a reactive form where we were creating a form using, React code. So we were doing some validation using some reactive forms. So Rxjs is a reactive way of programming JavaScript or any other front-end language. So Rxjs is altogether, it has nothing to do with just Angular. It is available in all the front-end technologies. So you can read a bit about Rxjs. So Angular 4, the Angular 4 version, it implemented observables and it removed promises by default. So that is one big, that was actually a big difference, moving from a normal template programming to something called as a reactive programming. Again, I have just told you a keyword, but again it has got world behind it. So we can say 19, what is reactive programming? So you can read a bit about it. Then came again a revolution in the market. People were using Angular and suddenly React took the market. Okay, React was very efficient in terms of re-rendering component. Let's say आपकी stock exchange की application है. Okay, I created a stock exchange application in which I'm listing down 100 stocks, and currently my stock market is running. So every second all those 100 properties are changing. Let's say किसी टाटा का stock change हुआ 100 से 200, किसी का stock हुआ 100 से 50. So every second we are having thousands, hundreds of changes. I'm only showing 100 stocks, so 100 of changes every second. Okay, और हो सकता है एक second में multiple time भी changes हो. So we want to track them. So in the meanwhile, React was taking up the market. So now Angular has a very strong competitor which is called as a React. So React has a different way altogether in order to re-render a component. So if you want to change a value inside a particular application, React is much faster than Angular. And Angular had to keep up that speed. So Angular have to compete with this language, and it has to find out certain efficient way in order to do the same stuff. Okay. So it came up and it was in the process of launching something which is called as a EVIVY. It's a EV renderer, rendering the component using some EV compiler, IV, I would say, IVY. So again, I would say Angular 6, Angular 7, Angular 8, and Angular 9. The major factors that you have while you are working with these languages is, now in Angular 9, you have enabled the IV compiler by default. In Angular 8, the IV compiler came as an optional parameter, and there were some performance tweaks. And Angular 7 was about improving your CLI tools, making your CLI much more faster, making your build activity much more, clearer and, concise. And I mean, since Angular 6, 7, 8, 9, and I think 10 is now again launched in certain days, or I think it has launched. So what they are focused on is how to have a better benchmarking of performance in Angular versus the previous version versus the new version. So they are consistently trying to track their performance, and they are consistently just trying to track their performance with respect to how React works, and they are changing their IV rendering engine so that it can be as performant as React. Again, they are also focused on reducing the size of these Angular libraries. So we had initially this Angular library in certain bytes. There was some 1 or 2 MB of file for Angular. Now it has started reducing to kilobytes. So that is, I mean, the major, the difference that we have, and they have added certain components. They have added certain controls like drag and drop, you know, draggable, droppable. So these were introduced in Angular 6, and there was a very small changes. So nothing big has come up since last Angular 4. The biggest thing right now is the IV compiler. And again, about IV compiler, you would say that this is a renderer, or this is a way to render your application more efficiently. So inner tweaks are such that your application is now performing better. So since Angular 4.0, the major updates has been in terms of performance. So they have to keep in market. They have to be the market holders because it's a Microsoft. So they want to be there. They want to compete, and every 6 months they release a new version with the improved performance. So I would say that's the crux of the different versions that we have. Biggest difference, IV compiler in Angular 9.0. So they'll ask, is TypeScript object oriented? You'll say yes. So they'll say, is JavaScript object oriented? You'll say no, JavaScript isn't object oriented. Then they'll say, okay, TypeScript is a wrapper of JavaScript. So how come TypeScript is a object oriented and JavaScript is not a object oriented? You can say TypeScript is a wrapper over JavaScript, and it implements or introduces those object oriented concepts. So that is a feature which is specific to TypeScript and not JavaScript. So they'll ask for what are interfaces. So again, few question on what you have done in Java. So you guys are from the Java background, so I think you would be great in explaining these concepts. What are interfaces? Abstract classes. They'll ask you about inheritance. And inheritance again, runtime. Okay, inheritance. Then we'll say polymorphism. That would be again some runtime versus compile time. JavaScript do not have a compile time polymorphism, so this is not supported. So this I would say I'll put down some X. So not supported in JavaScript. There could be a runtime polymorphism, but not. So they would come up with the concept of, again, what all concept do we have for object oriented and classes? Class inheritance, we have talked about abstract classes, interfaces, polymorphism, inheritance, and then you'll come up with the concept of ES6. So this was out of the scope of what we have done, but yeah, definitely important. What is ES6 Ecmascript? So we had few lines about it. So Ecmascript was introduced with a lot of new features after a very long time. So we talked about certain features, which was what is a spread and a rest. So spread operator, spread and rest operator, the triple dot operator that we talked about. We talked about arrows, so you can read more about arrows. Then we have, and there we have a lot of, more functionality, default parameters. Then we talked about promises. So these are some features. So I hope, you're comfortable with the question. If you are not knowing these questions to the depth, maybe you can relate to these questions. That is what I'm expecting. Are you good with the working concepts of JavaScript? And these are not very difficult concepts. These are very small concepts but you need to invest some time on it. What are those concepts? There's something called closures. There's something called context. Concept of hoisting. Then you have something called function chaining. Which major concept you have? You have function scoping, or you have scoping, I would say, scopes, and what more? And you should know what are functions. So this, the 6 points that I have stated over here: closure, context, hoisting, function chaining, scopes, and this function. It comprises of around 70% of entire JavaScript. So if you're done with this 66 concepts, you have learned the 60% concepts of JavaScript, and rest 40% is syntactical. What is a REST operator? What is arrow? What is a default parameter? What are promises? What is Rxcs? What is runtime polymorphism? How are we creating classes? So that is all a syntactical sugar over these 6 concepts. So anytime if you want to learn JavaScript more, just get into the concepts, these 6 concepts, and you know you would be mastering the JavaScript to a very high extent. And these are some concepts which even the experienced people who are having great experiences with Angular or React or other languages, even they are not that good. And then supporting this JavaScript, we have the concept of HTML5. So again, just like ES6, there was ES5 earlier, and similarly we had HTML4 earlier. So the world was stuck between HTML4 and HTML5 for a very long time, similar to what we had in ES5 and ES6. So again, when ES5 came into the picture, into the market, great differences were there. The performance was very high, and other people started to prefer working with HTML5 with a lot of controls. And even some of the controls of HTML5 are still not implemented by IE, Internet Explorer, which is quite expected from them. So even now, HTML5 has been in market since last 6 years, but IE has still not implemented all the specification of HTML5. So you can see HTML5 is the set of the latest features that we have for HTML. And along with this HTML5, people expect you to know certain things about CSS3. So again, we had CSS2 and then we have CSS3. World got stuck between CSS2 and CSS3 for a very long time. And luckily, all these technologies, HTML5, CSS3, and ES6, they all came together. And they completely changed the performance of JavaScript, in the real world. So once you are working with HTML4, CSS2, and ES5, when ES6, HTML5, and CSS, they came together, it improve the performance of your JavaScript, your front-end development to a next level, and that is what they are famous for. So people usually ask you that what is the difference between, or what is new in HTML5, or what is new in CSS3, and what is new in ES6. So this is what I would say, from my side, a summarization of what is expected out of a front-end developer or a mean stack or a full stack developer. So definitely, if you are if you're focusing on being a full stack developer, you should know, these front-end development, concepts as well to a good extent. So what are the fundamentals of the front end? I would say fundamentals is JavaScript, HTML, and CSS3. And again, for JavaScript, we have fundamental concept of closure, context, hoisting, function chaining, scopes, and functions itself. HTML5 has further some features, new features. CSS3 has got some new features. So you can very easily find those list of features, and they're quite easy. So I would say if you plan your career into a front-end development, it won't take you more than I would say 20 to 30 hours, or you have done Angular. Now if you start focusing on JavaScript, HTML5, and CSS3, it will hardly take you around 20 to 25, 30 hours to have these concepts up and running in your mind, to be full-fledged front-end developer. So if you want to move your career into this particular domain, I would say apart from Angular, spend some 20-30 hours on UI development, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. and then spend couple of few 20-30 more hours learning React, and you are I would say more than sufficient for getting a job in the market. What is the advanced technology in front end? Advanced technology, I would say React. Advanced technology, I don't know, I mean, how to define advanced technology. We can say rather what are the advanced or the new frameworks that are getting developed. Okay, technology can develop in multiple domains. Uh, I can say my front end technology is now moving towards certain scenario where I want user not to click any form. I want voice recognitions, facial recognition. So that is where the front end technology is heading. But if you talk about the new frameworks, definitely Angular, we have talked about. We have Vue.js, we have React, we have an upcoming language which is Svelte. So people are inclined toward that language, but never know what is the success factor of that language. So it's called Svelte. So these are the future, I would say. Vue.js and React is the future. Angular has been in market since last 10 years. People are already working on Angular. In front end world, people look for new stuff and they are very inclined towards it.